Okay, so just a couple quick things before we get started. First off, for Thursday, right? So you're going to be doing the reading in the slave trade and literature of abolition section. I'm not asking you to read this whole section at once, though, right? There are a couple of things in the section we're not going to be reading, and I want to save some of the meatier stuff for next Monday. What you are going to be reading are two anti-slavery arguments by Thomas Clarkson and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and William Cobbett's argument, I'm just going to warn everybody, is in favor of continuing the slave trade. I put this in here not to endorse Cobbett's arguments, which are ridiculous, but so that you can see what kinds of arguments people who were for the slave trade were making at the time, right? To put the rest of this into context, right? So Cobbett's article is purely contextual here, right? In fact, most of what we're going to be talking about, most of what we've been talking about has largely been contextual, and we're just going to keep building on that, right? And then next Monday, we're going to be reading excerpts from autobiographies written by former slaves. So this is what I want you doing for Thursday. Not Monday, Tuesday, right? Because we're Tuesday, Thursday. I don't know why I always get that mixed up. Yeah, Kyla.
It's in the same book, right? Same volume?
Yeah. I will tell you when we're going to move to the next volume. And it also says on the syllabus when we're going to be moving to volume E.
Oh.
So, yeah. But we've got a little while left with volume D.
Oh.
So I do also want to talk a little bit about the quizzes. A couple of you emailed me questions about this, and I figured I'd just address this in front of the whole class. The quizzes are timed. It's kind of like what would happen if we took the quiz in class, right? It's just you're doing it outside of class so that we don't have to shuffle papers around, giving more chances to spread disease. So they are timed. You have 12 minutes once you open it. And the purpose of the quizzes is to get you to read more actively, right? To get you to read for detail. So what I'm hoping you're going to be doing is reading the material beforehand, and instead of reading for the gist, right, taking notes, trying to paraphrase or summarize passages you don't understand to help you better grasp them, right? And kind of looking out for what sorts of things are important. Now, the other thing that I will tell you about the quiz, like apart from the fact that they're meant to encourage you to read actively, and that you do need to have done the reading before taking the quiz, they're also I'm also dropping your two lowest grades, right? We're going to do 12 quizzes. They're worth 1 point total each, and I'm going to drop the lowest two. So if you didn't do well on this one, we can consider this a kind of dry run, right? You know how this is going to go now. You know how these are going to work. You know what kinds of questions are going to be asked and what sorts of things to look for when you're reading, right? So, I'm sorry, you shook your head. You don't understand?
I'm unclear about the questions and the reading.
Pardon?
The questions and the quiz and the reading is very unclear. What am I looking for in the reading? Because it's so much. I just want to be more aware of what I want and what expected of me. That way I'm prepared for the quiz. Because I like to read, but I just want to know what to read.
Okay. Well, did you read the guide questions that I gave you? Okay. So those will usually be similar to some of the questions that are asked in the quiz, but not identical. So those will give you kinds of things to look for, right? And also, look for the kinds of things that we've been talking about in class, right? When we're reading generally. One of the reasons we're doing all this contextual stuff is to give you stuff to look for when you're doing the reading, right? That all of this is meant to help you understand what you're reading. Yes?
In the future, will we ever get more time, since there are questions where we have to write the answers out myself? I feel like I have to sometimes go back, even if I did read before, I feel like I have to maybe go back, because it sounds like that's what you're looking for in the question. It sounds like you want us to go back and use textual evidence. So sometimes I feel like I have to go back.
I just want you to answer the question. You don't have to go back and find a quote. But I am asking you about like details in the text, right? So what I want you to try to do is pay closer attention to detail when you do that first reading. Maybe read it more than once before you take the quiz.
But it'll always be 12 minutes, even when it's like that?
It will always be 12 minutes. I mean, it's 12 minutes when we do them in class. And look, nobody likes reading quizzes, right? You don't like taking them. I don't particularly like writing or grading them. It kind of feels sometimes to me a little bit like a juvenile activity, right? But I have found that they are effective in keeping people on task and in helping you better, in helping you find details in what you're reading, in helping you read more actively, basically, right? If I'm holding you more responsible for closer readings of the material. So that's why we do this. And like I said, again, so this is just the first one. You got 11 more to come, and I will drop the 2 lowest grades, right? So if you flub 1 or 2, it's not the end of the world, right? And it's also worth remembering, right, that each individual quiz is only worth 1 point. So even if you flub more than 1 or 2, as long as it's not all of them, right, or, say more than half of them, then you're still doing okay, right? Generally, I feel like if most of the class is getting a 75 or better most of the time, then we're doing all right. If that's not what's happening, then we'll step back and reassess and figure out what's going on. Any other questions about the quizzes?
Are you going to go over some of the questions or no?
We're going to talk about the material today, and it'll cover what was on the quiz.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we're going to do in class discussion, we'll cover what was on the quiz. Okay. So the music that I was playing today as you came into class is Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, and the reason that I chose this is because it was originally dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, who is really kind of like the key figure in European history at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries, right? So it would probably help if we start with a kind of quick overview of his career, right? So in 1793, we have the first major act of violence in the French Revolution. The King and Queen of France, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, are executed by the people. At this time, Napoleon is a common soldier working his way up through the ranks. In 1795, he wins a major military victory as an officer. And continues moving up through the ranks until he manages to get himself promoted to general. Now, this is one of the things that made him particularly inspiring to a lot of artists of more democratic or radical tendencies in the period, right? Is that here was a guy from a humble, ordinary background who managed to advance solely based on talent, right? So people who were, who preferred like a kind of meritocracy over, monarchy or aristocracy, saw this as, saw Napoleon's rise as a harbinger of good things to come, right? That, okay, the revolution here was on the right track. Hence, Beethoven's dedication of the symphony to Napoleon, right? He still saw him as an inspiring figure. Now, by 1799, Napoleon stages a coup and is declared first consul of the French revolutionary government, right? So they borrow all these titles, they borrowed these titles from the early Roman Republic, right? The Roman Republic was led by 2 consuls rather than by an emperor. And then after the Republican period, they're led by emperors, right? The French Revolution followed largely the same model here. It's like, okay, we're going to be led by this elected body, and we're going to have consuls rather than kings or dukes or earls or whatever, right? And so he carves a bloody swath across Europe, invading Austria, invading Italy, invading Spain and Portugal. And by 1805, declares himself emperor of France.
Who, Napoleon?
Yeah, not Beethoven.
So what's the difference between a consul and an emperor?
Well, a consul, a lot of it has to do with levels of accountability, right? An emperor is like a king, but over a larger swath of territory, right? An emperor isn't really accountable to anyone but himself. An emperor can kind of issue commands as he pleases. The first consul was still, at least theoretically, accountable to the public and also to other members of the National Assembly. Yeah, Alex.
How do you spell his last name?
Bunaparte. Bonaparte. So, pretty much all of the other nations in Europe and the Middle East form coalitions to try to stop Napoleon, are largely unsuccessful until 1815, when he meets his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. And is then sent into exile. He briefly comes back from exile and tries to mount a comeback, but is then again defeated and sent into exile on another, even more remote island. So, for the British, who are the people we're kind of most concerned with in this course, right? This is the culture we're most concerned with in this course. Napoleon is, for the average person and for the aristocracy, kind of like the boogeyman of the era, right? Napoleon is what they're afraid of. Radicals in the country, at least for a time, celebrate him, even if only privately. But the whole nation and its constituent parts, right? So not just Britain itself, but the wider British Empire, are caught up in wars with France from 1793 until 1815. So the earlier period of this, the period of more or less constant back and forth war, from 1793 to about 1801, is just referred to as the French Revolutionary Wars. The period from 1801 to 1815 is referred to specifically as the Napoleonic Wars. And, you know, I said more or less constant wars, and I want to stress the more or less part here, right? Think of this kind of like the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union from the 40s into the 1990s, right, where there isn't necessarily constant actual fighting. There are maybe little proxy wars here and there in various corners. And yeah, we don't have 22 years of constant battle here, right? We do have actual war breaking out every few years. And this fuels a lot of patriotic display in Britain. But I think we also have to recognize something unique about Britain's position in Europe that kept them insulated in a way that other countries that went to war with the French, Austria, Italy, Spain, Portugal, were not. What is special about Britain geographically if we're looking at a map of Europe?
It's big.
It's relatively big, right? But what's its relationship to the rest of the continent physically? If we're just looking at a map.
It's outside.
Yeah, it's an island, right? So, on some level at least, it's insulated and protected from invasion, right? Because anybody who tries to invade, right, they have to sail in and land on the coast, right? Somebody's likely to see them. Right? It's hard to get in secretly. So it's really not until World War II, when the Germans pretty thoroughly bombed British cities, because technology now allowed that to be done, that Britain itself is successfully invaded on any level, right? Now, this doesn't mean that people weren't constantly afraid of invasion, because one other thing that is special geographically about Britain is, like, if you go to Dover in the southeast of England and you look across the English Channel, right, on a clear day you can see France. Right? It's not that far away. You know, people regularly swim the English Channel, right? You know, it's not an insignificant distance, but it's close enough that certainly you would think it relatively easy for ships to cross, right? So you had British soldiers and sailors on one side of the channel staring out at French soldiers and sailors on the other side of the channel for 20 years, basically, right? Each wondering when the other side was going to blink. Now, Britain also did a lot to try to mitigate fear of invasion through building projects. So you will see in many former British territories and in Britain itself, let me figure out which one it is. And now we wait for the stupid projector to power up. Take time now. So you'll see round towers that look like this. These are called Martello towers. Because they're based on a 16th century Italian design. And they're designed to have a sort of like a lookout platform at the top and a place where you can mount cannons. So any invading force would be spotted and fired upon from these towers, right? You see them all over the coast of the island of Britain itself, also in Scotland and Wales. You see them in Ireland. There are several in Canada. There are also some in the Caribbean, right? So pretty much the whole British sphere of influence is covered with these, right? At least on the coasts. Now, the other thing that we see, in addition to in terms of preparedness, in addition to these Martello towers, is that again, like if you want to invade Britain, how do you have to get in?
By sea.
By sea, exactly. So there's a huge naval buildup. Right, it's during this period that Britain becomes the premier naval power in the world. Right? It's the Navy that is the source of their military strength. Because again, they're most afraid of invasion by sea. So if you control the sea, then you've got less to worry about. The British Navy was also involved in a lot of small sort of proxy conflicts with the French in the Caribbean in this period, right? I think we've already discussed how in the 18th century, the most valuable, in economic terms, British colonies were those in the Caribbean because of the sugar trade, right? So they fought very hard to protect these from the French, who were adjacent there. And, there was also fear generated by the Haitian Revolution that if they didn't clamp down on their own colonies, then slaves in Jamaica and the Virgin Islands and other such places would get similar ideas. Right, naval buildup, proxy conflicts in the Caribbean. Where else are we going with this? Oh, the other big thing was an issue in this naval buildup. Do any of you know what impressment was? When we're talking about a navy? Okay, this was actually an issue over which we went to war with the British towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars period. How many of you are familiar at all with the War of 1812? It's one of our lesser known and less talked about wars. Okay, Alex, what do you know about the causes of the War of 1812, if anything?
I don't remember. I just remember hearing.
Okay. And there's what's that piece of music of the 1812 overtures, the da 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 boom. They always play it at fireworks displays. So impressment was essentially the forced recruitment of sailors into the Navy. This is actually relevant to some of the poems I asked you to read for today. Some of this was done on land. You would have what were called press gangs going through towns and basically snatching up any man who looked the slightest bit idle or defenseless, slap him on a uniform and slap a uniform on him and put him on a ship. Congratulations, son, you're now part of the British Navy, whether you want to be or not. They did this to American sailors as well. They would capture American ships at sea and force the sailors into the British Navy, right? So this was the issue that sent us to war with the British in 1812. Was that they were impressing American soldiers to fight in the Napoleonic Wars. So on top of this, underneath this veneer of patriotism and rah-rah Britishness, there are a lot of practices that are violent and oppressive, right? Now, the great heroes in Britain of the age are one Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Who did, pardon?
It says Arthur, what again? I'm sorry.
Wellesley.
Oh, Will.
Wellellesley, who was the the British commander of land forces, and who finished Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. And Admiral Horatio Nelson, who won one of the most famous naval victories in British history at the Battle of Trafalgar, and was killed in action. And for that, managed to get a rum that is an imitation of Captain Morgan's named after him. So good for him there, I guess. But the reason I point these guys out in particular is that their names and the victories with which they're associated and their images then also reshape the British public landscape, right? So, for example, Nelson is memorialized throughout Britain on these column or pillar monuments, right, where he's, you've got the figure of the admiral standing far above the crowd walking down below him. The most famous of these is in Trafalgar Square in London, right, which is named itself for the battle in which Nelson was killed. There are Wellington monuments of various sorts all over the place as well. Right, this is the Wellington Monument in Phoenix Park in Dublin, Wellington's birthplace. Right, he was an Irishman, by birth anyway. This is a monument in London in which Wellington's features are given to the Greek hero Achilles. And this is another Wellington monument, an equestrian statue, in Piccadilly Square in London. And there are Wellington monuments, just like there are Nelson monuments, all over Great Britain and former British colonies. Again, we saw that first Wellington monument, the big one, the big obelisk, was in Dublin, right? So the Napoleonic Wars and their heroes become a big part of public memory and public life, right? And the celebration of the heroes of these wars is still all over basically every place the British had planted their flag by then. Now, these then also often become targets for resistance to British authority, right? So, for example, there used to be a monument called Nelson's Pillar in the center of Dublin. In the 1960s, a group of Irish nationalists who were opposed to British rule in Northern Ireland blew it up. Right, it's not there anymore. So, one thing that we have to think about when we talk about monuments generally, right, is that monuments themselves aren't necessarily about history, right? They're not necessarily, nobody learns history. Like, if you go to this Wellington Monument, you don't learn anything about the Battle of Waterloo, right? What you learn from looking at a monument is whose history is considered important enough to be memorialized by the public, right? So it's really more about power than it is about history. And you learn a lot about how the dominant culture sees itself, right? Right, you know, if we go back again, like to this Nelson, you know, this Nelson's pillar here, this Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, right? We've got this noble, aristocratic-looking figure standing on top of the pillar, looking out as though looking out to sea, right? But the things that we don't think about are the things that are propping him up on that pillar, right? We don't see the soldiers that were pressed, the sailors that were pressed into service, right? We don't see the messy details of Nelson's personal life, which involved a lot of philandering and probably syphilis. You know, we don't see the slave plantations in the West Indies that helped him make his fortune and that he fought to defend, right? So there's a lot that this guy is standing on that the monument does not acknowledge. Just as there's a lot going on under the surface of British propaganda efforts during the war that the public largely does not see, right? So, to give you an example of what British propaganda looked like in this period, right? So, this is a fairly typical cartoon in which you have this figure representing Britain, right? He's tall, and he's got his sword out, and he's shouting at this figure representing Napoleon over here across the English Channel, right? They're standing looking, they're giant-sized figures standing looking at each other across the channel. What do we notice about the way Napoleon looks as opposed to the way the British figure here looks?
It looks way smaller, like it's less important.
Yeah, he's drawn like a midget, right?
Yeah.
What do you notice about his hat in particular?
It's big.
Yeah, the hat is disproportionate, right? So the hat is too big for his body.
Yeah.
Now, we tend to sort of buy into the historical notion that Napoleon was a small man, right? That he was shorter than average. He was actually about average height. The reason we think he was a small man, physically, is largely because of the success of British propaganda efforts like this that depicted him as tiny in order to make him seem insignificant, right? He's a little man wearing a hat that's too big for him. And here comes, you know, big bad John Bull on the other side of the sea to come and teach him his business, right? Now, on the other side of this, we had propaganda that ran, we had kind of anti-propaganda that ran in the opposite direction, really closer to the direction most of the readings that we looked at for today were going in, right? So this is a 1795 panel illustration by James Gilray called John Bull's Progress. So Gilray was a popular comic artist of the period, or you know, the things that he drew were sort of like the late 18th century equivalent of comics. And do any of you know who or what John Bull is traditionally? Okay, so John Bull is the British equivalent of Uncle Sam. Right. But where Uncle Sam is tall and thin, John Bull is usually kind of short, little, fat, aggressive guy in a bowler hat wearing a Union Jack vest, right? So John Bull is meant as a kind of stand-in for Britain more generally. And so here we have, in the first panel, John Bull happy, right? We have this ordinary rural householder asleep in front of the fire, dog and a cat. His two sons are playing with a little pet bird. His wife is spinning behind him. Looks like an older daughter is churning butter or something like that. And he's got his little mug of beer, and all is well, right? Everything's right with the world. Then, John Bull buys into all of the patriotic blather that he's hearing and volunteers for the army, right? So here we see John Bull going to the wars. Now, because there is no longer a breadwinner at home, John Bull's family is starving, and they have to take all their possessions to the pawnbroker and sell them. Even those possessions, the spinning wheel, the butter churn, all the farming implements that they could be using to make a living. And then in the final panel, and this kind of relates pretty directly to that Wordsworth poem, The Discharge Soldier, we have what would actually have been a pretty familiar sight in late 18th and early 19th century Britain. These maimed soldiers coming home, unable physically to work for their bread anymore. Right, so now that John Bull is back, right, he's unrecognizable. He's got one eye, one leg, and he's half starved to death, right? So the basic idea, the basic argument of the four panels is that by taking men who could be doing productive things at home away and force them to fight in these wars, you are leading them and their families into starvation, right? You're destroying the productive capacity of the nation for what is essentially a grudge, right? And that's a lot of the argument. If we look at the William Godwin piece, that's a big part of the argument that Godwin is making. If we turn to page 743, we've got Godwin's Enquiry Concerning Political Justice and an Influence on General Virtue and Happiness. And that's just, those are the kinds of titles 18th century philosophers give to their works, right? It's these very long, florid titles. But Godwin is probably the premier radical philosopher in Britain of the late 18th century. And he is a member of a particularly brilliant family, a brilliant and accomplished family as well. So he is the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, and the father of Mary Shelley, who we'll be reading a little bit later in the term, but who was the author, most famous is the author of what novel? Does anybody know? Anybody know what Mary Shelley wrote?
Is it a famous book, or?
It is, yes.
Is it a movie? No?
Well, there are several movie versions of it, yes. Think man makes monster out of dead tissues, animates it with electricity. Yeah, exactly. She's the author of Frankenstein. And her husband, Percy Shelley, is one of the most important British poets of the early 19th century. So yeah, this is a particularly accomplished family, both in intellectual achievement, in literature, and in radical politics, right? So if we look at the beginning of Godwin's essay here on page 743, right? From Of the Causes of War. One of the most essential principles of political justice is diametrically the reverse of that which impostors and patriots have too frequently agreed to recommend. So, what do we make of the fact that he yokes impostors and patriots together? What does this suggest he thinks about patriotism as a value? If he's putting imposters and patriots together here.
Oh, they're not who they say they are?
Yeah, that patriots are basically imposters and liars, right? So it's a negative view of patriotism. He goes on to explain the view that he attributes to these imposters and patriots, right? Their perpetual exhortation has been, love your country. Sink the personal existence of individuals in the existence of the community. Make little account of the particular men of whom the society consists, but aim at the general wealth, prosperity, and glory. Purify your mind from the gross ideas of sense, and elevate it to the single contemplation of that abstract individual, of which particular men are so many detached members, valuable only for the place they fill. So, this language that he attributes to patriots, right? Does he see patriots as valuing the individual person or the group? The group. And the group, really in the idealized form of the nation, right? Right? The individual, according to Godwin, is expected to sacrifice whatever he has for the good of this imaginary nation. The lessons of reason on this head are precisely opposite. Society is an ideal existence, and not on its own account entitled to the smallest regard. The wealth, prosperity, and glory of the whole are unintelligible chimeras. Set no value on anything, but in proportion as you are convinced of its tendency to make individual men happy and virtuous. Benefit by every practicable mode man wherever he exists, but be not deceived by the specious idea of affording services to a body of men, for which no individual man is the better. Society was instituted not for the sake of glory, not to furnish splendid materials for the page of history, but for the benefit of its members. The love of our country, if we would speak accurately, is another of those specious illusions which have been invented by impostors in order to render the multitude the blind instruments of their crooked designs. So, is Godwin necessarily saying that society is a bad thing? No, society is a good thing as long as it contributes to the wealth and prosperity and good health of its individual members, right? But it's a bad thing when it can be used to bludgeon people into doing things that are bad for them, right? And that's what he's talking about here when he talks about patriotism, right? The love of country, he argues, is one of those false illusions, those chimeras, right? That's what does anybody know what the word chimera means? Was that a no?
No.
Okay. So a chimera is a sort of composite illusion, right? It's an illusion that's made up of a bunch of complicated parts. It's named for a Greek monster, a monster from Greek mythology that was, it had the head, it was a creature with, it was a dragon with 3 heads, the head of a serpent, the head of a lion, and the head of a goat. So a chimera is a sort of complex composite illusion. Now, it's also worth noting what he has to say about war specifically towards the end of this essay, right? So, patriotism is a perversion of the purposes of society, right? If you look on page 744, right, because individuals were liable to error and suffered their apprehensions of justice to be perverted by a bias in favor of themselves, government was instituted, right? Okay, so government exists essentially to keep people from simply pursuing their own interests, right? You know, to try to judge fairly between individuals. Because nations were susceptible of a similar weakness and could find no sufficient umpire to whom to appeal, war was introduced. Men were induced deliberately to seek each other's lives and to adjudge the controversies between them, not according to the dictates of reason and justice, but as either should prove most successful in devastation and murder. This was no doubt in the first instance, the extremity of exasperation and rage, but it has since been converted into a trade. One part of the nation pays another part to murder and be murdered in their stead, and the most trivial causes, a supposed insult or a sally of youthful ambition, have sufficed to deluge provinces with blood. Right, so I think part of the most important part of this is what's going on at the end, right? Who starts wars and who fights them?
The leaders start the wars, but the members have to fight.
Yeah, the ordinary people, right, who have been to some extent professionalized as soldiers, have to go off and fight the wars, but they're not the ones who actually start them. Right, they're started by wealthy people, by aristocrats, by leaders, and often for no good reason. And indeed, why would they need good reason when they're largely insulated from the consequences, right? The consequences fall on the head of the ordinary soldier, not on the head of the wealthy aristocrat. And I want us to keep these two paragraphs here in mind in a couple of weeks when we read Thomas Carlyle, who is going to be saying something rather similar. So just, keep all this in mind here, right? We can have no adequate idea of this evil unless we visit, at least in imagination, a field of battle. Here men deliberately destroy each other by thousands without any resentment against or even knowledge of each other. The plain is strewed with death in all its various forms. Anguish and wounds display the diversified modes in which they can torment the human frame. Towns are burned, ships are blown up in the air while the mangled limbs descend on every side, the fields are laid desolate, the wives of the inhabitants exposed to brutal insults, and their children driven forth to hunger and nakedness. It would be despicable to mention, along with these scenes of horror and the total subversion of all ideas of moral justice they must occasion in the auditors and spectators, the immense treasures which are wrung in the form of taxes from those inhabitants whose residence is at a distance from the scene. So again, he's playing up the difference here between people who actually have to fight on battlefields and live near or on them, and people who reside at a comfortable distance, who can sort of go on, with a kind of rah-rah pro-war attitude because they're not directly affected, right? But what happens to land and people in war, according to Godwin's argument here?
Gets destroyed.
Yeah. Fields that might have been intended for farming are torn up. Ships that could just carry trade goods back and forth are destroyed. And human lives are wasted in the effort, right? Not just those of soldiers, but also those of civilians who happen to get in the way and who might be dependents of soldiers who either have to stay away for a long time or get themselves killed, right? So this becomes an extremely influential argument. It's a kind of, in a lot of ways, it's both a humanitarian and an economic argument against war. And the reason I wanted to focus on this is because we are going to be seeing this popping up again, right? We're going to be seeing very, very similar imagery later on. Now, I'd also like to talk a little bit about the way Romantic poetry is affected by imagery from the war, right? So one thing that we can note, the Coleridge poem, The Fears and Solitude, and the Anna Letitia Aiken poem or is it she Aiken or Barbald in that one? She is, yeah, that's right, she's Barbald there. One thing they have in common is that they are making arguments about British isolation, right, not being enough protection. That isolation does not mean you can't be invaded, right? So they both begin their poems by painting this kind of idea of a green and pleasant land that could very well be destroyed by marching boots any day now, right? But I think that some of what's going on in these other poems is both less paranoid and more interesting. So let's look at the Wordsworth poem quickly, The Discharge Soldier. Now, one thing I do quickly want to point to, on page 747, the soldier is telling his story. And the reason I want to point this out quickly is because it does relate to certain course themes here, right? He told a simple fact that he had been a soldier to the tropic isles gone, whence he had landed now some 10 days past, right? So where has this guy been fighting? Has he been fighting in Europe? If he is to the tropic isles gone. So if we're thinking about the British sphere of influence in the 1790s, where has he been? Yeah, he's been fighting in the Caribbean. So this guy has actually been fighting not to protect Europe from the ravages of Napoleon, but to protect British economic interests in the sugar trade, right? So remember how I said in the first class that empire tends to be at the back of just about everything that happens in British writing in the 18th and 19th centuries? This is an example of that, right? So yeah, we've got like the basic context for this is the Napoleonic Wars, but this specific soldier has been fighting not so much to protect England, but to protect the empire and its economic interests, right? And what's the condition of this guy when Wordsworth meets him?
He's harmed, like he's hurt.
Yeah, or he's. Are we given a description of any actual physical injury that he has? Like, does he have? Is he missing a leg or an eye or an arm? He's physically whole, right? But he's referred to throughout as ghostly, pale, haunted, right? So I don't think we are meant to take this figure as a.
Like he's actually there.
Well, I was going to say that I don't think we're meant to take him as an actual ghost, but he is kind of like a shell of what he was before he left, right? So if we look on page 746, right, his face was turned towards the road, yet not as if he sought for any living thing. He appeared forlorn and desolate, a man cut off from all his kind, and more than half detached from his own nature. So while he may not be, he may not be physically maimed, it seems like he's spiritually maimed in some way, right? That his participation in the wars destroyed something in him. And what is he? Where is the soldier trying to go? Or what is he trying to do? Yeah. He never specifies where home is, right? And there's something that's meant to be particularly sad and heart-wrenching about this pale and ghostly-looking soldier who's just, who's been discharged now and has just kind of dropped off on the shore and left to find his own way, right? So part of the point that Wordsworth is arguing here is like about the way returned veterans are treated, right? Why couldn't the army have paid for a coach to take this guy home, right? Why couldn't, they have, sent an escort or something, right? Why couldn't they be taking better care of these people when they return, right? Because remember, like I said, that the figure of the maimed or unemployed soldier, right, is a pretty common sight throughout this whole period. Right, they're all over the place, and indeed, that will also provoke reform of the British poor laws, not to make them more generous, but to actually make them more punitive, because there are so many vagrants hanging about now. So
when he says the discharged soldier, is it a particular person he's referring to?
Pardon?
When he says the discharged soldier, right?
Uh-huh.
Is it referring to somebody in particular?
Yeah, he's referring to the guy that he meets on the road there, right?
So it's any soldier, it's just not a particular person with a name.
It's a kind of generalized figure, right? The soldier's never given a name.
Yes.
But yeah, he uses a particular imaginary figure to illustrate the point, right? So, he's walking alone and happy and tranquil as he does, because that's what romantic poets do. And then he sees someone who, on his way whose loneliness is in no way tranquil, right? And spend some time with this guy to try to ease his journey a little bit, and take him someplace where he can at least get a hot meal. Now, if we look at Robert Southey's poem, The Victory, we get some imagery that is quite specific to British popular culture in the period. Right? It starts with thundering church bells, right? There were church bells ringing throughout Britain constantly whenever there was any news, good or bad, brought home to these, to rural villages about the war, right? So page 751, right? Hark, how the church bell's thundering harmony stuns the glad ear. Tidings of joy have come, good tidings of great joy. Two gallant ships met on the element. They met, they fought a desperate fight. Good tidings of great joy. Old England triumphed. Yet another day of glory for the ruler of the waves. For those who fell, 'twas in their country's cause. They have their passing paragraphs of praise and are forgotten. There was one who died in that day's glory, whose obscure name no proud historian's page will chronicle. Peace to his honest soul. I read his name, 'twas in the list of slaughter, and blessed God the sound was not familiar to mine ear. But it was told me after that this man was one whom lawful violence had forced from his own home and wife and little ones, who by his labor lived. Right? Remember impressment? That he was one whose uncorrupted heart could keenly feel a husband's love, a father's anxiousness, that from the wages of his toil he fed the distant dear ones, and would talk of them at midnight when he trod the silent deck with him he valued, talk of them of joys that he had known. O God, and of the hour when they should meet again, till his full heart, his manly heart, at last would overflow even like a child's with very tenderness. Peace to his honest spirit. Suddenly it came, and merciful the ball of death. For it came suddenly and shattered him, and left no moment's agonizing thought on those he loved so well. So basically he's walking the deck at night, thinking about his family, and he gets surprised by a cannonball from another ship and blown overboard, right? He, ocean deep, now lies at rest. Be thou her comforter, who art the widow's friend. Man does not know what a cold sickness made her blood run back when first she heard the tidings of the fight. Man does not know with what a dreadful hope she listened to the names of those who died. Man does not know, or knowing will not heed, with what an agony of tenderness she gazed upon her children and beheld his image who was gone. O God, be thou her comforter, who art the widow's friend. So let's think about this poem in terms of its title, right? The Victory. So in what way does the poem describe a victory? What's the victory in the title?
The British ship won against the other ship.
Yeah, British ship beats French ship, right? Good. But what does the news of the victory and the ringing church bells ignore?
All the people that died from the ship before.
Yeah, it's not, the point here is that it's not a victory for their survivors, right? It might be a victory for Britain, right? But this is a point very similar to one Godwin was making, right? That, this guy's widow and children are left without a provider now. And do they even have a body to bury?
No.
No, because he died at sea, right? So there's nothing left of him except memory. Now, it's probably useful to juxtapose this against Thomas de Quincey's account.
What does that first word say again?
Ignores individual dead soldiers. Of the woman he met in the village when he was working on the mail carriages, right? So, what De Quincey is doing in that last piece, that prose piece, is essentially, he's a newspaper delivery boy, right? These mail coaches go out from London, out into rural areas, out to other cities, right? So they go throughout England, right? Not just delivering mail, but also delivering news, and also carrying people back and forth, right? So passengers could take the mail coach to and from London, right? So what this mail coach is on the one hand, part of the development of a public sphere in Britain, right? So we've already looked at, when we looked at those French Revolutionary pamphlets, right, how much of the debate over the revolution in Britain was being fought in print, right? And usually very, very quickly, right? Mary Wollstonecraft responded to Edmund Burke within a few days and rushed that off to the presses and then gets her pamphlet in people's hands, right? So what we mean by a public sphere is essentially space for public debate, which is something that had not really existed in European societies prior to the 18th century. Some of this is due to the explosion of print culture, newspapers, more reliable mail, that sort of thing, right? But it's also due to the development of certain gathering places, especially in urban areas. Coffee houses become a big gathering space for debating societies and for intellectuals. And we see the formation of various kind of like debating or interest groups in this period as well. So the growth of this public sphere, it's like, it doesn't look like a connected society to us because news still travels comparatively slowly, right? We're used to news traveling in an instant. But the fact that, these connections are being made at all is actually a fairly new thing, right? That we have connected and coordinated systems of communication without even, the benefit of something so basic as a telegraph. But De Quincey is in a lot of ways like taking the opposite tack that Southey does in The Victor, right? So he's telling this woman has asked about her son, if there's any news of her only son, who was fighting in the Peninsular Campaign. And she tells De Quincey that he was a trooper in the 23rd Dragoons. And what does De Quincey know about what happened to that regiment? Yeah, that pretty much all of them died, right? In a heroic charge. Does he tell the woman this? No, he wants her to be able to at least bask in that warm glow of her son's unit's heroism, right? Without knowing specifically that he's probably dead. So De Quincey here, well, he's responsible for spreading the news, right? He is also doing pretty much the same thing that those church bells were doing in the Robert Southey poem, right? Now, it's here painted as a kind of act of compassion, right? That he doesn't want to tell this, this poor woman that her only son has been killed. But it is all wrapped up in that warm, rosy glow of patriotism and nationalism, right? So, well, let her feel like she's contributed something good to England for a little while, and then let her mourn, right? So, a lot of the effects of the war on the British psyche are actually pretty complex, right? On the one hand, you have these nationalistic celebrations going on everywhere. You've got monuments to heroes going up all over the place. Places in Britain being renamed for these heroes and for their famous battles. But on the other hand, you have on the base level, like the base human level, real suffering and depopulation and deprivation, happening not because Britain is being invaded, but because so many of her people are being sent off to fight in the Caribbean or in Europe. So this is all, again, like primarily context for understanding what's going on historically in the period that Romanticism emerges out of, right? So we will be bringing all of this back to bear on the Romantic poetry we're going to look at in a week or two. And all of this is also kind of relevant to our discussion of the slave trade next time and the autobiographies by former slaves we'll be looking at next Tuesday. So yeah, all of this stuff does link up, right? It is all connected. And I'll give you reading questions for it this afternoon when I'm in my office.